You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In the previous episode, we talked all about cannabis and sex. But cannabis is just one of many different substances that people often combine with sexual activity. So in today's show, we're going to talk all about psychedelics and sex. Psychedelic use in general is on the rise, and recent data suggests that it's at an all-time high among young adults. Of course, these drugs are not always used for sexual purposes, but many people enjoy using psychedelics to have trippy sex. We're going to discuss the sexual effects of several common psychedelics, including MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine. We'll also explore the potential benefits and risks of these drugs and what people who wish to combine sex and substances need to know in terms of having safer and more pleasurable experiences, including the kinds of conversations that you should have with your partner before, during, and after. I am joined once again by Ashley Manta, an award-winning sex educator and certified sexologist. She has become a sought-after authority on mindfully combining sex and cannabis as part of her Canisexual brand, which has also expanded to include psychedelics. She is the author of the book, The CBD Solution, Sex. This is going to be another fascinating conversation. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. When people talk about men's health and fitness, something that often gets left out of the story is penis health. But we need to talk about it because maintaining a healthy penis is important for maintaining a healthy sex life. But how exactly do you do that? Allow me to introduce you to Exerciser, the world's best-selling penis pump with over 1 million satisfied customers. Exerciser harnesses the power of water through a hydraulic vacuum to draw blood safely into the penis and promote healthy circulation. Exerciser is the world's only FDA-regulated hydro pump, and it provides a discreet and effective way to exercise an area of the body that's neglected in the gym so that you can truly get a full-body workout. Some of the benefits include improved erection quality, more staying power, and more intense orgasms. It only takes a few minutes per use and can easily be added to your regular bathing routine. The greatest benefit is typically felt after just 2 weeks of regular use. But similar to the gym, results vary by user and use. Exerciser offers a 60-day, 100% money-back guarantee starting from the day the product lands on your doorstep. If the user is not satisfied for any reason, they'll receive a full refund. To learn more and get a 20% discount off of your purchase, check the show notes for the link or visit exerciser.com/SAP. That's exerciser.com/SAP. Okay, Ashley, let's talk about sex in altered states. So,
yes.
A lot of people use substances as sexual enhancers. We talked all about marijuana and cannabis in the last episode. So in this show, we're going to dive into some other commonly used drugs, and specifically several that fall under the category of psychedelics. So let's start with MDMA or ecstasy, which is one of the most popular. What can you tell us about this drug in terms of how it affects people's sexual experiences?
Oh, so many different ways. MDMA is a stimulant. The A stands for amphetamine. So it is an up experience. You are not going to find yourself sleepy on MDMA for the most part. It is considered a heart opener. It's an entheogen. So I find that I am much more able to hold vulnerable truths when I am exploring with MDMA. Things that would normally maybe make me feel uncomfortable or feel very edgy are much more readily woven into the fabric of my reality. And you can hold kind of complex, even diametrically opposed ideas at the same time. Like it creates space. It also, because it dumps all of your serotonin receptors at once, feels amazing. It's like standing in the middle of a Care Bear stare with like just all of the rainbows and stars and hearts and sparkles just completely enveloping your body. everything feels like an orgasm, which is a little bit ironic because a lot of people find it very difficult to actually have an orgasm when they are on MDMA, that you get so close and it feels so good, but you can't quite pop over. And that's normal. But you feel so good it doesn't matter because everything feels like an orgasm.
And what you described there is consistent with what I've seen in the literature in terms of MDMA's effects and how people report that it changes sexual experiences. And, it, like every other drug, is a mixed bag, right? Where it offers certain effects that can be enhancing to the sexual experience, but it can also create or pose certain sexual difficulties. So you noted orgasm as being one of them. And some people on MDMA find it harder to get aroused or to have an orgasm. So it's, there's often that trade-off. But as you said, that change in mental state may make it worthwhile for people. But also that's, I think, part of the reason why MDMA is increasingly being looked at as a tool that is sometimes used in couples therapy, right? Because it can help put those partners in that right altered state to really connect with one another if that's something that they might have a lot of difficulty with in everyday life.
Absolutely. Even outside of an explicitly sexual context, I think it's really valuable for partners to explore MDMA together from a connection perspective, from a conflict resolution perspective. Maybe they have old resentments that they've been holding on to for years, and they finally speak into them and can hold space for them in a really understanding and compassionate way and access empathy that might otherwise be challenging for them to access.
Yeah, this reminds me of an early episode I recorded for the podcast that was called Love Drugs, and it was all about a book called Love Drugs. And MDMA was one of the ones that we talked about. And it's different from a lot of the other substances that people often combine with sex because there is that connectedness element to it that you don't necessarily get with a lot of other substances that are commonly combined with sex.
I couldn't agree more. It's such a magical place to start. And it's a very constrained window, whereas some drugs like LSD can last 7, 9, 11 hours. MDMA is a very tidy 4-hour window, unless you were to re-up and take more. But if you just take a dose, that you're going to have pretty close to exactly 4 hours. And then there's usually a pretty hard stop. You are rolling, coming in, going out. And just about the moment that you're like, I want this to go on forever, this feels so good, is when the rolls start coming less frequently. And you're like, damn it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I am not rolling anymore, at all.
Yeah, and as we talked about in the last episode, different substances always affect people in different ways. But you're right that the appeal of certain substances may be that they might have somewhat more predictable effects in terms of their half-life, their lifespan in the body, in terms of how long they're actually going to produce those effects. So having that predictability is also certainly another appealing feature of that drug to a lot of folks.
Absolutely. And I think it helps you plan better so that you can really be clear about how much of a time commitment you're making. And then when you bring in something like, I have ADHD, I have a lover who also has ADHD, when you have neurodivergence added to it and you add a stimulant, all of a sudden you're having an almost Adderall-like effect where you're clear and you're like, oh my gosh, my brain is functioning so much more efficiently and effectively, and I'm able to communicate things I've struggled with. And it feels so good. It's a really fun place to play for people who are neurodivergent.
And that's interesting. And that would be worth a whole podcast episode in its own right in terms of how, some of these drugs interact or intersect with neurodivergence and different reasons that different people might find them appealing or might want to use them. Totally under-researched area, but certainly worthy of discussion. Now, let's talk about psilocybin next. I must admit, I don't know a lot about this drug. And actually, until recently, I'm not sure if I really ever even had heard of it before. But now it seems like it's everywhere, where lots and lots of people are talking about it, in part because we're seeing more research on psilocybin being used in psychedelic-assisted therapies, and also some areas are decriminalizing it, and that's opening the door for more widespread use. So we actually have an upcoming SPSB, Society for Personality and Social Psychology, Sexuality Pre-Conference that takes place in February 2025. And actually the theme of our conference is Rocky Mountain High, because the conference takes place in Denver, Colorado, and Denver was the first city to decriminalize psilocybin. So I'm very fascinated to hear and learn more about that particular drug and how it's being used and what the research is that's being done right now. So it's a drug that's generated a lot of media attention and a lot of research attention in recent years as a potential therapeutic aid for depression, anxiety, and a number of other mental health conditions. So what can you tell us about psilocybin in terms of how it affects people's sexual experiences?
Absolutely. So just a little bit about it to begin with is it is the most famous or most well-known compound that comes out of mushrooms, what are often called magic mushrooms.
Okay, I've heard of those.
Right? Those you're familiar with.
Yes.
So it's the mushrooms that produce the most amounts of psilocybin are the psilocybe cubensis mushrooms. There are other varietals of mushrooms that also produce psilocybin, but that's the one that most people know about and have heard of. And so the fruit body of the mushroom is consumed, whether like you just take a handful of mushrooms or you grind it up and put it into a tea, or there's mushroom gummies that have typically pre-extracted the psilocybin. And when you ingest it, it is turned into psilocin, which is the sort of active version of psilocybin. And you can hack that by applying citric acid to it before you consume it, which is often called lemon teching. So if you were to grind up some mushrooms, soak them in lemon juice, and then add them to a tea or just consume them, you will have a faster come on and a more intense experience because you're sort of doing the work of your digestive system on the front end. In terms of what it's going to do for you in a sexual context, everyone's a little bit different, of course, so that's sort of the standard disclaimer. But what a lot of folks report is having a lot of feelings of embodiment and deep presence, of feeling open to new ideas, new experiences. There has been some research to show that it increases neuroplasticity, not just while you're on the trip itself, but also in the days and weeks that follow, which is kind of a cool thing. And much like MDMA in terms of that entheogenic sort of experience where your heart feels more open, you feel more compassion, you feel more love, not just for others, but also for yourself. And I think that really enhances the intimacy of the experience. And my first psychedelic experience with a partner was on psilocybin, and it was really intense. I took way too much because I trusted someone who said that they knew what they were doing, and they didn't know what they were doing quite as much as I believed they did. And so I ended up doing a full eighth, which is 3.5 grams of mushrooms, and we lemon teched them, which was a lot for a first time. Like, we had all of the conversations about consent and what we wanted to do together and all of the things that I teach people to do on the front end before you are in a medicine space where you're all of a sudden like not really necessarily making sound decisions in the moment because you're being led by the universe's pull. And it was intense. It was transformative. I had a lot of visual hallucinations, both positive hallucinations, like the walls like grew a face and started talking to me. And then also negative hallucinations where like I couldn't see something was right in front of me. And then auditory hallucinate, like it was a lot of stimuli. But I found that there were ways to kind of keep coming back to the moment and keep coming back to my body that allowed me to really deeply connect with my partner and with my pleasure that were unlike anything I'd ever experienced before, even with cannabis.
Yeah, as you were talking about that, it reminds me of how, it's very important for people to be cognizant of the fact that if they're going to try a new substance for the first time, they don't necessarily know how it's going to impact them. And just because somebody else says that they know what they're doing and what the right dose is, you don't know what the right dose is for you. There's always that sort of trial and error thing where people kind of have to figure it out. And, as we discussed with cannabis, there can be too much of a good thing when it comes to substances, and more is not always better. And so if people are going to try something new for the first time, it's better to start low and go slow.
Yes. And what I didn't understand at the time, because only recently has more research been done, and a lot of that has been spearheaded by Oakland Hyphae, which is a really amazing organization out of Oakland that focuses on potency testing and really like understanding how mushrooms work in a very scientific way. Because just going by dry weight, we've learned, is not a foolproof way of dosing. Because 3.5 grams of golden teachers is very different than 3.5 grams of penis envy mushrooms. And even within that, like who grew it and what it was grown on and how it was dried and all of these different factors. What do you weigh? What kind of tolerance do you have? What kind of experience do you have with the drug? What's your metabolism like kind of broadly? All of these factors are really specific and it will impact how your experience goes. And most people are just like, oh yeah, like I took a cap or I took a stem or, oh, I saw that it was blue. And so I knew that it was going to be more. No, like people are guessing in the dark. They have no clue. And so there's a mushroom church in Oakland called the Church of Ambrosia. And they have partnered with Oakland Hyphae to put out some like really helpful science and dosing guides. And they've tested hundreds of different strains of mushrooms and compiled a bar graph chart of the potency of each of the mushrooms. And it goes from, just a tiny bit to big, long bars. And you realize the breadth of the possible effects. And so it becomes so, so important to really do your research, really be an informed consumer, and to not dive straight into intimacy. Like, my kind of golden rule is if you're going to do a new substance, do it on your own with a trip sitter first in a completely non-sexual context. Like just see how your body does with this substance. Where does it take you? What kinds of things come up? Because sometimes it feels awesome. And sometimes like all of your deep, dark traumas like pop up and they're like, hey, we're going to talk about this now.
Yep. Sometimes there can be unexpected effects with some of these drugs. Psilocybin is another fascinating drug because, as I mentioned, it's increasingly being studied in the context of therapeutic applications. And we did an episode fairly recently. The guest was Jeff Lundgren, and he wrote a book recently about psychedelic-assisted sex therapy. And this is one of the drugs that has been studied a little bit more in that particular area. And one of the ways in which it might be beneficial in terms of some of these sexual contexts when people might have sexual difficulties is that it can help in terms of treating underlying mood, anxiety, depression, other kinds of mental health issues that can then open the door to more sex and intimacy, because often what's at the root of sexual problems is an affective disorder, right? So sometimes sexual dysfunction is masking, an underlying mood disorder that's in need of treatment. And it's fascinating to see the research that's out there now finding that many of these psychedelics and other substances might be very helpful for treating those conditions. I know it's still incredibly controversial and there's still a lot more science to be done, but it's a different way of coming at the issue as opposed to the more traditional antidepressant treatments, which we know opens up a whole other issue in terms of things like post-SSRI, sexual dysfunction, and so forth.
Yes, that's real. And I experienced that personally. That was part of what led me to mushrooms to begin with. I had always had depression and anxiety, and I had been on every antidepressant you can think of and would have really bad withdrawal symptoms from the antidepressants when I would switch to a different one. And finally doing that first massive dose of mushrooms back in 2015, I was able to completely leave antidepressants behind and feel like much more over my emotional center of gravity on the day-to-day. Like, I don't want to say that it cured my depression or anything like extreme like that, but it really made a tangible difference and allowed me to do the other work of the talk therapy and the somatic therapy to kind of create structures in myself to help sustain that over time.
So interesting. Now, another drug that is often combined, another psychedelic that is often used in sexual contexts is ketamine. And it's been in the news quite a bit lately as yet another potential therapeutic treatment where scientists are studying it. But we also know that it has long been used in various sexual contexts. It does seem to be becoming increasingly popular these days. So tell us a little bit about ketamine in terms of its sexual effects.
So ketamine's an interesting one. My experience with ketamine has actually exclusively been in a clinical setting. I did ketamine treatments for my depression, which, did happen to rear its ugly head again. It happens. And so what I found as I was using it in a clinical setting, and at a much higher dose than people would be using it recreationally, but it is a complete dissociative. Like, you forget that you have a body. You are just a soul floating in the universe when you're on ketamine. And when you're using it recreationally and in sexual settings at lower doses, it's an anesthetic. So it does have like analgesic effects. You don't feel your body the same way, which can allow you to access things that maybe you wouldn't be able to access if you were feeling all of your body's sensations, which is a bit of a double-edged sword. Like, on one hand, that can be positive and you can feel open and be able to enjoy what's happening instead of being distracted by pain. And on the other hand, you are essentially numbing out your body's pain responses, which could lead to injury. So I tend to tread like very carefully with ketamine and sex because it's so easy to go too far and be in this fully dissociated, what they call a K-hole, which in a clinical setting is incredibly therapeutic and positive and like all the things. But in a partnered setting, how do you consent if you can't feel your body? How do you consent if you're so out of it that you can't form words anymore? That gets tricky. And so that's one of the ones that I would definitely encourage people to use a lot of caution with. And really, I mean, I say this across the board for psychedelics and sex, but especially with something like ketamine, like that needs to be a very trusted partner who has a demonstrable commitment to your bodily autonomy, consent, and pleasure, and who like genuinely cares about your experience and who is going to be looking out to make sure that you're okay and not just like, oh, good, they're passed out, time to do the thing that they never wanted to do. Like, ugh.
Yeah. And, that is a really, really important point. And unfortunately, not everyone who is consuming these substances and then pursuing sexual activity later is doing that with a trusted partner. Many people will do some of these substances while they're out at a bar or in a public setting or at a party. And, that opens the door for bad things to happen sometimes because you're not surrounded by people that you can fully trust. And it's something we're going to talk about a little bit more later in the show, is things that you need to know in terms of if you're exploring this as a sexual enhancer and it's going to put you in this heightened state of vulnerability, we need to make sure that you're doing this in the safest way possible. But yeah, that's something I definitely want to come back to a little bit later. So we know from what you've discussed, like with all of these drugs, it's mixed effects, right? So there can be very positive things that might happen. There can also be negative sides, and it's going to depend a lot on, what the dosage of the drug is, how it interacts with your own body. And so it's kind of a complex thing. It's not as simple as like, I'm just going to try this and I'm going to have this predictable effect that my friend has or my partner has whenever they do that drug, just because you don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's one of the key things that I want to see couples talking about in their series of conversations before they have altered sex together, which I kind of lay out in this presentation that I give at different like Tantra festivals and conferences, is, okay, what are we hoping to experience individually? What are we hoping to experience together? How are we going to handle it if we have markedly different experiences where one person has an amazing time and this was so good and they can't wait to do it again, and the other person's like, absolutely fucking not. This was it. Never again. How are you going to grapple with that in your relationship, especially if you're a monogamous couple? Like, what is that going to look like? And what's your sort of range of outcomes? What would best case scenario look like? What would worst case scenario look like? And what are some of the possibilities in between, which is usually where things fall?
Yeah. And I think that's a really, really important point in all of this, is having that advanced pre-communication and negotiation, because sometimes unexpected things will happen. You might have divergent experiences. And what are you going to do if that happens? I think with a lot of things that we discuss when it comes to sex, like, I talk a lot about sexual fantasies because that's one of the big things that I study. Sometimes it takes a bit of practice to make it perfect. Like, you often need to try things a couple of times whenever you're trying something new. And I think that same sort of goes for when people might want to try a substance with their partner in a sexual context. The first time might not go according to plan, but you can always adjust and change course in future situations to try and correct for that. Now, something that I think is worth discussing as part of all of this is that, we've talked about psychedelics here. We talked about cannabis in the last episode, but the single most common substance that people combine with sex is alcohol. A lot of people drink in order to lower inhibitions, to get in the mood, and to facilitate sex. So I wanted to ask, how are psychedelic drugs like the ones that we've been talking about different from alcohol in terms of their sexual effects, right? So in terms of facilitating things like pleasure and intimacy, how does alcohol compare to psychedelics?
Well, alcohol is a depressant, and so it tends to have more sedating qualities. Not exclusively, and certainly people that are, chugging Four Locos are having a very different experience with alcohol. But
Yeah, people sometimes combine the uppers and downers, that's for
right,
sure.
which is a very confusing experience. But having had sex on a lot of different drugs at this point in my life, including alcohol, I feel like alcohol gets me farther away from where I want to be in a sexual space. It makes me feel less embodied. It makes me feel less present. I'm sort of up in the air, like floating, spinning sometimes. And I really want to be right here with my partner. And I find that alcohol gets in the way of that a lot of the time. Cannabis has the opposite effect for me, especially at that kind of Goldilocks dose, right? That just right, where you're like, ooh, yes, this is it. I can be right here with my partner with cannabis. Ditto with MDMA. Even things like LSD and psilocybin, depending on where you are in the trip. Whereas for me, alcohol is very much a disinhibitor, which can be nice for people that feel like they're kind of partitioned from their truest expression. But there's just so many potential issues with alcohol. And, coming from a sexual violence prevention education background from working with the Cleary Center in college and doing rape crisis counseling, it was drilled into our heads over and over. Alcohol is the number one date rape drug because it's so easy to find yourself very suggestible and doing things that maybe you would not have wanted to do sober, but all of a sudden you're drunk and you can't say no anymore. So alcohol is another one of those that's okay, if you're with somebody you trust, if you've, consumed alcohol in a non-sexual setting before and you're all right, well, I know that if I have a drink, it'll help me loosen up. That's one thing. But having blackout drunk sex is just not it for my personal ethos.
And when you look at research, there's a study that I cite in my textbook, The Psychology of Human Sexuality, that looks at the sexual effects of alcohol, MDMA, and cannabis in terms of, comparing what people's experiences with all those substances are like. And one of the key things that differentiates alcohol is that people are much more likely to describe a sort of numbing sensation that often comes from it because alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. And if you consume too much of it, your body kind of shuts down in a lot of ways. And that also contributes to a lot of sexual problems and difficulties with alcohol use, where erectile difficulties, orgasmic difficulties become much more common as people consume more alcohol. So while it reduces those inhibitions, it also simultaneously can create some of those sexual difficulties. Also, some of the other things that we see in the research are that people, when they consume alcohol, are more likely to report engaging in rougher sex compared to when they're on cannabis or psychedelics. So it can be a very different intensity in terms of sexual experience. And I think that's actually tied in with the numbing effect, where people are sort of counteracting that to some extent, maybe pursuing a more intense way of having sex because they might not be feeling as much sensation. And then one other thing we see in the research too is that people are also much more likely to report sexual regrets when they're using alcohol compared to other substances, because alcohol has that impaired decision-making element associated with it. And so people are more likely to regret partners that they had sex with. They're more likely to have sex with somebody that they don't know well, and more likely to do things that they wish they hadn't done. So alcohol is the most common substance people combine with sex, but it's also the one that is linked to the most negative outcomes when you look at the research.
It makes sense to me, especially because alcohol is so normalized in our culture. Whereas with psychedelics, people will actually listen to me when I say, hey, you need to have these conversations, you need to have these things on hand, you need to plan, you need to do all these things. With alcohol, people are like, why? I drink all the time. I don't need to think through that. I don't need to make these kinds of preparations. I don't need to do the work to make it awesome. I'm just going to drink because that's what I do every Friday night. And so I think that disconnect also leads to more adverse experiences.
Yeah. And then there's also the thing where, anybody who's consumed alcohol before knows that sometimes it'll happen that you'll just get to a point where you cross that limit and you're like, how the fuck did I get so drunk? Like it sneaks up on you, right? And that's when you sort of enter that state where you've kind of crossed into this territory where there's, nothing you can do. Like once you're at that state, you can't backtrack from it. And then if people continue to drink from there, that's where it often gets worse.
Absolutely. And alcohol can kill you. You can overdose on alcohol. Whereas you cannot overdose on cannabis. You might wish you were dead, but you won't die. You can't overdose on mushrooms or LSD. Like you can go too far that's like doesn't feel good and you have a bad trip and you get anxious and you're nauseous or you're, having diarrhea and like those kinds of unpleasant effects, but not the kinds that are going to kill you. Whereas alcohol can literally kill you.
So for people who are interested in combining psychedelics and sex, one of the biggest considerations is who you're going to have trippy sex with. Yes. Now, because when you use one of these substances, as we said, it can put you in this vulnerable state. So what are some of the considerations here in terms of how you might choose a safe partner to explore this kind of sex with?
I'm so glad you asked, because this is one of my favorite things to kind of start with sex in altered states. And I have compiled a list of green flags and red flags. And green flags include things like, this is a trusted long-term partner. This is someone who has demonstrated that they are a skillful communicator. They can be very clear about their boundaries, desires, fears, limitations. They have prior experience with the substance. That's really helpful that going in, this is not a new thing that you have to grapple with, like, what's it going to do on top of everything else? I want someone who has a really, really strong track record of respecting my boundaries, that has shown over and over and over again that even given an opportunity to transgress my boundaries, they will choose not to. They will choose to respect them. Those are all green flags for me. And ideally, with the trusted long-term partner, I would say someone you've been with for at least 6 months. A year would be better, but 6 months is really the bare minimum, because every bad story I have ever heard of someone falling in love with someone on psychedelics, it was someone that they, were at Burning Man and they did mushrooms for the first time and they tripped over this dude in the orgy dome, and all of a sudden they were like, I'm going to divorce my family, my parakeet, and my children and marry this person that I just met because the medicine told me to. And it's like, no, the fuck it did not. Psychedelics speak in metaphor. You can't take that shit literally, kind of like the Bible. Like it's something that you really need to have a tether to reality, but it can so easily make you feel like, no, the medicine spoke to me. It's true. So having someone that you've known for some time, that you have a pre-established relationship with, is going to set you up for success. On the other hand, red flags would be things like someone who's not safe or sex savvy, someone who is like wishy-washy about condoms, who kind of does the like, oh, do we really have to use them? Like, I'm clean. Hate that. Don't ever fuck someone who says they're clean. Terribly stigmatizing language. If it's a spontaneous suggestion, if somebody's like, hey, my friend gave me MDMA at the club last night, like, let's just do it this afternoon. Maybe not the best idea. If people are inconsistent with aftercare and follow-ups, because this is such a heart-opening, vulnerable experience, you need integration in the immediate aftermath and in the days and weeks that follow, so that you can help weave it into the fabric of your reality. And if you have somebody who's going to just like fuck your brains out and then vamoose into the ether, that's not going to feel good.
Yeah. So lots of great advice there. Now, let's say you've chosen a partner, right? You have a safe partner that you're going to explore with. What are some of the conversations that you want to have with that partner before, during, and after sex to promote pleasure and safety when you're going to be using psychedelics or substances together?
Yeah, there are so many different pieces. I think it really starts with a pretty rigorous self-inventory of, how do I want to feel? Why am I even choosing to do this? Like, what am I hoping this is going to do for me and my relationship? How confident am I in my ability to communicate my boundaries before, during, and after? What steps am I already putting into place to help myself ground and integrate before, during, and after? And then when it comes to a more, dyadic conversation between you and your partner, at least 1 to 2 days in advance, if not like a week or two, I think it's good to kind of start setting these things in motion and planning ahead of time. Where are we going to do it? What are we going to do? how many different substances? Is it just one substance? Are we going to use cannabis with the thing? Are we going to do a specific dose? Are we planning to re-up? A lot of people re-up. And so if you're going to do an additional dose to kind of extend the experience, what's your initial dose going to be? What's the re-up dose going to be? When are you going to take it? And has it been like pre-measured and set aside? Have you tested this substance for contaminants? We live in a time of fentanyl. And so anything could be contaminated and everything needs to be tested. Do you have fentanyl test strips on hand? Do you have Narcan on hand in case you missed something? Like those kinds of really thoughtful, proactive harm reduction things are important to have conversations about. If something goes terribly askew, are we going to call the police or the ambulance? Are you a demographic that maybe would not benefit from having the police show up at your house? And if that's the case, how are you going to handle an emergency situation? Is there another sober adult nearby that you can call on for support? How much time do you have to set aside for this? Do you have a couple hours or do you have the whole weekend? And then, negotiating. What are we hoping to do together in this experience? Do we want it to be like penetrative sex? Do we want it to be toys? Do we want it to be role play? Do we want it to be dirty talk? Are we like, we're open to anything? Let's just see how it goes. Do we want to try something we've never tried before? Like all of those things I think are really helpful kind of logistical questions. And then checking in the day of, has anything changed since we had that initial conversation? Did you just find out that your pet is terminally ill? Because that's going to really shape your experience today. Are you dealing with a disagreement or stress at work, or you just got in a fight with a friend or anything like that that's going to be kind of seeping into your experience with your partner? Presencing that and being like, you know what? I thought today was going to be the day, but today's actually not the day. Let's do this another time when I really feel like over my emotional center of gravity.
I was going to say, I love that level of thoughtfulness that you're describing when it comes to thinking about all of this. But unfortunately, I think the reason a lot of people use substances in the first place is because they need something to disinhibit them, or because they just find it hard to communicate and talk about sex in general. And so they're hoping that the substance is going to open the door to just having sex more naturally and easily. And so, in terms of what you described, yeah, I think that sounds like the ideal in terms of having all of those conversations. But for some people, they're going to be like, well, but doesn't that defeat the purpose of using the substance? Because I don't know how to talk about sex and all that stuff in the first place.
I have so much empathy for people who react that way. Like, I get it. It's all scary. It feels so big to have these kinds of conversations. And, I realize that I am sort of describing an ideal scenario, right? And so not everyone's going to do every one of these things, but I think the more of them that you do, and yeah, it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to feel clunky at first. Lean into that because drugs are uncomfortable. So like if you are too timid to have these conversations before you do the drug, you should not be doing the drug. Much like, if you're too caught in your head to have a safer sex conversation with a new partner, maybe you shouldn't be fucking them yet, because if you're that cut off from like your authentic truth and your voice, like that's work that you need to do. Like this is not a beginner friendly experience, honestly. Like it's an advanced move. And so if you're not able to play at that level yet, then do the work in therapy and, take the time to get to that level. You can't go from zero to competing in the Olympics. So start training.
Yeah. And I think related to all of this, working on your just general sexual communication skills first might be kind of a valuable first step for people who might be wanting to explore this route, just to make sure that you've got that communication piece there, because as you've laid out, that is essential to all of this in terms of ensuring safe and pleasurable experiences. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Ashley. It was truly a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Absolutely. I really appreciate you having me and getting to have this conversation. I am on Instagram at Canasexual, or you can find my website, canasexual.com. That's CANNASEXUAL. My book is The CBD Solution Sex, and that's available everywhere books are sold. I'm actually coming to you from Bespoke LA, which is a space I work with in Los Angeles, where I hold monthly sex positive mixers called Cosmic Connections. So we have one tonight that's going to be self-care with a sound bath bath and chair massages and all sorts of yumminess. And so I would love to connect with you. I do sex coaching with clients, individuals as well as couples, and please reach out.
Well, I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sexandpsychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.